Welcome to Secret Historian, where forgotten kings, lost empires, and hidden histories are retold to help you relax and drift into peaceful sleep. Did you realize that the history of human civilization contains odd gaps? Entire centuries disappeared from Europe, leaving no traces, no events, and no records. Did you know that certain ancient societies knew significantly more about mathematics, astronomy, and building than anyone in their time should have known? However, textbooks hardly address them. Who then gets to decide what should be forgotten and what should be remembered? In actuality, there have always been forces actively influencing humankind's collective memory. They destroyed libraries, outlawed the dissemination of information, and set fire to literature. They knew something extremely well, not because they were ignorant. Power comes from knowledge. You can control the present if you can control memory. Furthermore, you may influence the future by managing the present. History isn't actually what we have left today. It's a narrative that has undergone editing, revision, and occasionally a complete rewrite. The actual truth is sometimes concealed deep inside our own subconscious, concealed under stone, buried beneath thousands of layers of dust, and sealed away in prohibited manuscripts. Although we were never trained to question anything, there was that part of us that always felt strange. And if that's how you've ever felt, you've come to the correct location. If you've ever had the feeling that the history we've studied isn't completely accurate. Greetings from Secret Historian, where each tale offers a leisurely exploration of the unsolved riddles of our common history. History isn't the only thing you hear here. The bits that were hidden start to show, because often the realities that were never intended to be remembered are the most potent ones. But now you're prepared to find them again. We frequently picture history as a continuous, uninterrupted flow, like a seamless movie that spans from antiquity to the present. However, if you examine more closely, an oddity begins to emerge. Silent spaces exist. Everyone seems to continue on as if nothing out of the ordinary ever happened. There are no new structures, no noteworthy inventions, and no trustworthy historical records, just emptiness and a blank area. The so-called lost century is among the most dubious of these gaps. Between 614 and 714 AD, 100 years passed with almost no evidence remaining. Historical occurrences were little documented. No discernible advancements in politics, philosophy, architecture, or the arts. If they are referenced at all, the emperors who are said to have governed during this period are also linked. Toa hazy. Unconfirmed chronology, according to a contentious notion known as the phantom timey hypothesis. The people in charge at the time may have purposefully inserted this entire Iranto, the historical record. According to some academics, Pope Sylvester II and Emperor Otto III may have changed the calendar to make the year 1000, a symbolic turning point that signified the establishment of an empire that was predetermined by God. If accurate, it would indicate that our timeline has been altered. The question raised by this idea is difficult to ignore, even though conventional historians do not accept it. Why does it seem that whole eras of human history are absent? It's not limited to the 7th century either. Examine historical societies. In Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, there are hundreds of years without any administrative documents, maps, or recently found It's as though a whole era was covered by a dark curtain. And if you believe that this occurred as a result of documents being lost over time, you might think about the Library of Alexandria, with hundreds of thousands of manuscripts from various civilizations. It was once praised as the greatest knowledge asserter in antiquity. Egyptian, Persian, Indian, Chinese, and even long-lost Mesopotamian texts are included, in addition to Greek classics. Scholars from all over the world gathered there to exchange and preserve knowledge. Then it started to burn. Who started the fire is unknown. Caesar's army is blamed by some religious extremists, are blamed by others. Others still maintain that the devastation occurred over several centuries in a concerted attempt to eradicate uncontrollable knowledge. Why books airburnt is a more important question. Why put forth knowledge if it is light? Why burn the memory if the history is kept in a library? It's not due to the errors in those texts. They didn't match the narrative that someone wanted to tell. That's why. It's not necessarily an oversight when there is a blank space in the historical record. It might be the outcome of a conscious action, destroying a civilization off the map, outlawing documentation, or setting a library on fire. All of it leaves scars on humanity's memory, but none of it leaves blood. How many more memories are still being concealed if entire centuries can vanish? We often presume that what is written down is true when we read any page of history. However, like light, the truth only shines where someone decides to turn it on. Power is necessary for the existence of history. Those in possession of the pen have had the ability to influence memory ever since writing was invented. Therefore, what happened has never been the true question. Who told the story and what they wanted us to remember are the true questions. Power and knowledge have coexisted for thousands of years, but they are not meant to be shared. Both Eastern and Western empires have one thing in common. They just documented what was necessary for their survival. They referred to it as a tactical retreat if they were defeated in battle. Insurrection was the term used when a province rebelled. If there was a more developed civilization, it was written off as primitive and removed from the map of history. In many eras, religion also acted as a gatekeeper for knowledge. Books were burnt because they contained ideas that contradicted orthodoxy, not because they had no value. During the medieval era, only things that were sanctioned by the church were permitted to spread. Any other idea, even a straightforward query, was labeled heretical. Furthermore, knowledge remained filtered, classified, and regulated even when the world entered the modern era. Right now, through processes rather than public punishment, the educational system, the publishing system, the academic system, and the mechanism for funding research. Every system establishes its own criteria. What does it mean to be valuable, trustworthy, or scientific? Anything beyond that framework is thus pushed into a gray area where it lacks value, credibility, and supporting data. Have we ever considered the question of who establishes these criteria, though? And why do we feel discouraged about challenging them? Curricula are used to instruct students. Committees write the curricula. National education systems authorize committees, and the cycle continues, generation after generation, producing what could be referred to as a curated memory. The system as a whole only permits what fits into the pre-existing picture, not because someone is purposefully lying. What then happens to the portions that aren't compatible? They're not turned away, they are disregarded. No argument, no counter-argument, just quiet. And what is never spoken gradually vanishes, as you are aware, like an unnamed room, lost within the home to which it belongs. Do we, the ones who follow, have the authority to reopen those doors? Is the history we are studying objective, or only a version that was allowed? Furthermore, who has the authority to determine what has been forgotten, if anything has been removed from memory? Have you ever seen a name on an ancient map that used to represent almost all of northern Eurasia, but is now entirely unfamiliar? Tartaria is that name. Tartaria, which stretches from the eastern boundaries of Russia to the borders of China and deep into Central Asia, is clearly depicted on dozens of European maps from the 16th to the 18th centuries. It wasn't some uncharted wilderness or foggy border. It had boundaries. There were cities there. It was divided into different territories. There were people there. Why, therefore, is hardly anyone aware of it nowadays? No school textbook will mention Tartaria. Its language, culture, and political systems are not taught in formal education. No significant museum exhibits its artifacts, and it just didn't exist in most people's imaginations. The odd thing, though, is that Tartaria's remnants aren't as small as we've been told. There are eerily identical architectural structures throughout Europe and Asia that exhibit technical features that are well beyond what was anticipated at the time: arched windows, enormous stone columns, opulent domes, and even concealed electrical systems built into the walls. All of them appear to be traces of a single architectural logic, nor isolated nor random, although there is no obvious cultural connection between them. Numerous government buildings, museums, and train stations constructed in entirely separate nations during the 18th and 19th centuries share the same forms, proportions, and decorative patterns. According to some independent experts, these are remaining pieces of Tartaria that have been recycled by successive governments, given new names, and nailed to the front. Naturally, anyone who disputes Tartaria is frequently written off as a conspiracy theorist. However, have you observed anything? The door to exploration silently closes each time a civilization is declared a myth. Was Tartaria really an empire in its own right? Or did early Europeans simply use it as a general geographic phrase to refer to areas they had not yet explored? The response might not be obvious. One factor, though, is that contemporary history chose to ignore the issue rather than investigate it. Just deletion, no research, no instruction, no discussion. Furthermore, Tartaria is not the exclusive instance. Ask students about their knowledge of the ancient Tendian civilizations that predated the Incas, the northern Mesopotamian cultures, or the medieval African kingdoms that traded with India and Arabia. Additionally, you'll frequently receive blank stares, not because young people don't care, but rather because they were never taught those stories. And eventually, things that aren't spoken start to seem like they never happened. A civilization that doesn't belong in textbooks gradually fades from the general consciousness. However, human memory is more difficult to erase than a line in a curriculum. Gaps, hazy intuitions, unidentified questions, and occasionally that peaceful sense are all left behind. The very indication that a fragment of history is still awaiting remembrance is something I've seen before. 2 syllables may be the most controversial name in ancient history. The city of Atlantis, which was arranged in concentric circles, was said to have sophisticated defensive systems, an abundance of resources, architecture that was much ahead of its time, and canals that connected each ring via water, a thriving community that disappeared overnight, as if it had never been there. Timaeus and Critias, 2 well-known dialogues by the Greek philosopher Plato, include the whole account of Atlantis. In a single day and night of tragedy, he said, the sea engulfed Atlantis, a powerful civilization that had once dared to threaten ancient Athens. It was circa 360 BCE. Plato was a philosopher, not a historian, as many quickly point out, and it's possible that he merely used Atlantis as an allegory, a warning about the perils of moral decay and unbridled power. However, why does the story contain so many technical details, if such is the case? Plato's description of Atlantis was not merely symbolic. He gave the width of the canals, the proportions of the city's rings, and the metals they used, including the enigmatic coracalcum, which was long believed to be mythological until a similar alloy was found aboard a sunken ship off the coast of Sicily, which begs the unsettling question: could Plato have been telling the truth? And why has the rest of the world insisted on referring to it as a myth if he was? Similar to Tartaria, once a narrative is classified as a legend, it is no longer considered a historical lead and is instead treated as a bedtime story. However, that does not imply that it is not real. The actual location of Atlantis, whether it be in Antarctica or the Sahara Desert, beneath the Caribbean Sea, or off the coast of Gibraltar, has been the subject of innumerable speculations throughout the past century. Every website has some supporting data and an equal number of refutations. Here's the odd bit, though. The story of Atlantis appears to be pushed further into myth the more information comes to light. Why is that? Perhaps because the genesis of human civilization might not have started in Mesopotamia or Egypt, as we have been taught, if Atlantis really existed, and if it indeed held knowledge beyond its time. It would require a complete revision of the historical timeline. And while history is more than simply the past, not everyone is prepared to accept that. It serves as the cornerstone of our perspective. It outlines what we refer to as civilization, science, and progress. Are we still at the pinnacle? We believe we are. If there was once a civilization that emerged first and then vanished, perhaps that is why Atlantis was buried not merely under the seas, but also under layers of willful skepticism. You are free to investigate Atlantis. Everyone, however, will caution you against taking legends too seriously. Conversations in the academic world conclude quietly with that kind of caution. However, if history is a puzzle with missing pieces, perhaps what we refer to as legends are the missing pieces. Of all the ancient civilizations that are included in textbooks, it is nearly impossible to exclude the name of Egypt, pyramids, the Nile River, the Sphinx, and pharaohs. Millions of pupils worldwide have these pictures seared in their memories. However, there is an odd paradox. The more we learn about Egypt, the less we seem to know about the real events, because everything has a predetermined storyline, and the ancient Egyptians were shrewd farmers who gradually accumulated wealth and established an empire via hard work. However, that argument begins to fall apart when we examine what they left behind. Let's start with the Giza pyramids. Each of the 3 enormous pyramids that rise in the desert is composed of multi-ton, stony blocks that are precisely piled millimeters apart without the use of mortar. Their angles closely match the tilt of the Earth's axis and are almost perfect. With a margin of error less than 0, the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza nearly perfectly lines up with the planet's prime meridian, 5, with startling precision. The pyramid's arrangement also corresponds to the locations of the 3 stars in the constellation of Orion. Try constructing something similar today. If you believe that to be merely a coincidence, nobody has succeeded in doing so. Modern engineers are still unable to match the accuracy that these so-called ancient farmers attained thousands of years ago. Despite the use of cranes, heavy-duty tractors, and laser-guided positioning devices. So, is there a discrepancy? A daring question has been posed by numerous independent scholars. Were the pyramids built by the ancient Egyptians, or were they merely the heirs? Because the building of the Great Pyramid is not documented in any ancient Egyptian scripture. No records. This tall building, one of the most famous people on the planet, is now totally unknown. And that's only one instance. The ancient Egyptians were far ahead of their time in their understanding of astronomy. They computed the year's length with a margin of error less than 0, monitored the Sirius star cycle, and comprehended Earth's axial tilt to 5 days. Only recently, with the use of sophisticated technologies, has contemporary science verified this level of accuracy. They used chemical compounds that we have yet to recreate for mummification, practiced sound-based healing, and used an unknown process to carve granite, which is harder than iron tools. Why, therefore, aren't these facts covered in regular history classes? Why are important inquiries concerning the extent of Egyptian knowledge so frequently ignored and written off as speculative? Is it possible that acknowledging that they had sophisticated technology would force us to reconsider the entire course of human evolution? Does such timeless knowledge not suit the tidy, linear narrative of humans gradually evolving from barbarism to civilization? More importantly, who provided them with such knowledge, if it ever existed? The gods who taught the ancient Egyptians to construct, heal, farm, and read the stars were mentioned frequently. However, in contemporary readings, we disregard the notion that these gods might have served as emblems of a prehistoric civilization that disappeared without a trace, and dismiss those stories as merely mythology. Egypt made no effort to conceal its past. Everything was left to be seen in the future after being etched into stones. However, those who recounted the tale decided to only share a portion of it. And the answer to everything we've never dared to dream might be in the portion that is left unsaid, the bit that is kept silent. Assuming that only modern humans shave the means and know-how to create great miracles, we frequently attribute all significant technological advancements to the modern era. However, there is something unnerving about some old buildings when you view them with serious clarity rather than romantic eyes. The chronology of human evolution does not accommodate them. They seem like relics from the future that are out of place in the far past. Let's start with the most well-known, the Giza pyramids, which we just discussed. A masterwork of engineering, geometry, and astronomy that has stood the test of time without collapsing. There is no clear Egyptian record that explains how it was constructed, and no one has been able to reproduce it using ancient techniques to this day. Let's now go from Egypt's deserts and travel across the ocean to South America, where one of the planet's most amazing constructions, silently and largely undiscovered, lies. Pumapunku is more than 3,800 meters above sea level and situated high in the Bolivian Andes. The stone edifice, known as Pumapunku, is composed of enormous rocks that weigh hundreds of tons and have precisely symmetrical H-shaped grooves that were cut with laser-like accuracy. Some of the blocks fit together so well that they look like they belong on a contemporary industrial assembly line. However, the site was created more than a millennium ago, before the wheel was invented by the Andean people. How did they cut? Granite and diorite, which are tougher than steel. Without the use of hardened metal tools, one would wonder. Nobody is aware. Surprisingly, history books hardly ever address that subject. You continue on to the Middle East and reach Göbekli in present-day Turkey, a location that compelled archaeologists to revise the chronology of human architecture. Göbekli was discovered in the 1990s and is older than Stonehenge or the Giza pyramids. It has numerous, enormous, T-shaped stone pillars that are more than 5 meters tall and artistically engraved with animal symbols. According to conventional history, all of these structures were constructed during a period when people were still hunting, gathering, and dwelling in caves. They had no idea what temples or organized religion were, because no one is aware. The website is put in a unique category, allowing it to be enigmatic, without interfering with the official narrative. One thing, however, is evident when you take a step back and examine the pyramids of Egypt, Pumapunku, and Göbekli. They don't align with the progression timeline that we've been taught. They display cutting-edge technology for the era. They don't leave a trace of who built them. They don't use any recognized tools that can do the job. They don't fit the presumptive level of civilization for their time. The fact that they are all explained in ways that minimize their remarkable nature is arguably the most striking of them, because acknowledging that highly developed civilizations predate our own era would imply that human history isn't a linear progression, but rather a cycle of rise, fall, rebuild, and forget. Thus, the current system prefers to ignore that possibility rather than face it. However, there is a silent murmur behind every stone that cannot be cut, every building that cannot be restored, and every monument that is out of date with its designated age. A whole chapter of our own story has been lost. However, there is another side that is rarely brought up. One of the biggest and most private information bases in human history is housed within the Vatican. Over 85 kilometers of shelves, loaded with millions of documents, are concealed behind the heavy doors of the Vatican Apostolic Archive, formerly known as the Vatican Secret Archive. No one outside the Vatican is permitted to view most of it, including handwritten letters from Michelangelo and Galileo, decrees denouncing heresy, old astronomical manuscripts, and even documents from the Roman Empire before its collapse. Access is only allowed to a few number of scholars, and even then, only for brief periods of time and under close supervision. No documents or photos may be taken. Deep inquiries are not encouraged. This begs the awkward question: Why would a religious organization possess such extensive collections of world history? It has to do with knowledge's power, because the future and belief are at the influence of whoever controls memory. The Vatican has served as an information gatekeeper for centuries. Ancient science was deemed heretical when it conflicted with doctrine. Pagan literatures destroyed when they challenged the established religious order. The speaker was denounced for threatening the geocentric model with a cosmic hypothesis, similar to Giordano Bruno, who was executed by burning at the stake in 1604, asserting that the universe is limitless and could have an unlimited number of worlds. Although it is not the only institution with a history of censorship, the Vatican is among the oldest and most secretive, and it has the power to influence how people remember their own history by determining what information is permitted to be shared and what is not. It's simple to believe that secrets are extinct in the current world, where information seems to be everywhere. The actual secrets, however, are still hidden in archives that are only accessible by the guardians. And the Vatican is special because of that. Not because it conceals the truth, but rather because it has the authority to decide which truths are kept silent. Might the records include mentions of extinct ancient societies? Is it possible that the world has never seen any texts from Atlantis, Egypt, or Babylon? Could old maps indicate places that have vanished or were never recognized by the general public? Because all you see are closed doors, even if you are standing right in front of that archive tower. And once more, only those with the key can tell the story of history. Burning books is arguably the most severe attack on intelligence in a world where words serve as the medium through which mankind preserves its memories, knowledge, and ambitions. Seeing how many flames have been kindled over human history is also heartbreaking. The Meyer books, the ancient Chinese classics, and the Renaissance's forbidden works. Let's start with one of the most catastrophic intellectual disasters in history, Alexandria's library. It was formerly regarded as the greatest repository of knowledge in antiquity, containing hundreds of thousands of manuscripts ranging from astronomy and mathematics to philosophy, medicine, and bold ideas that, if they had survived, may have fundamentally altered modern civilization. However, battle, rebellion, and negligence caused almost all of it to be lost. Who exactly started the fire is unknown. Julius Caesar, they say. Others point the finger at religious leaders, Roman generals, or a string of catastrophic incidents. Spanning ages, this is what we do know. The loss was irreversible. It wasn't limited to Egypt, either. When the Spanish arrived in the land of the Maya in the Americas, they discovered a society that had their own calendar, alphabet, and astronomical knowledge that was very accurate. Nevertheless, almost all of Mia's writings were destroyed as heresy within a few short years. One of the first Europeans to communicate with the Maya, Father Diego Dander, personally ordered hundreds of sacred manuscripts destroyed and later bemoaned the fact that no one could comprehend the Mara. One of the greatest tragedies in history might be that irony. In Asia, a state-sanctioned book burning and scholar purge occurred during Qin Shi Huang's rule in ancient China in the interest of ideological unity. Almost 460 academics were put to death. Other schools of thought had their books destroyed. Philosophical, medical, and astronomical information that did not fit the empire's ideology was methodically eradicated. However, knowledge censorship did not stop in antiquity. A list known as the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, literature, developed during the Renaissance as intellectuals started to question the Church's interpretation of reality. We now revere the names that were on the list: Descartes, Spinoza, Copernicus, and Galileo. Under inexplicable circumstances, several books that had once been labeled as dangerous to human religion and Sullivan, stranger, were concealed or disappeared, instead of being destroyed. Research, it all lingers on the hazy boundary between myth and truth. The collective quiet pushed them into the darkness. The decision of what should be destroyed and what should be preserved is not made by chance in a world where knowledge equals power. Humanity must make a conscious decision about what it must forget and what it can remember. One thing is certain: even though we may never fully understand what was lost, in addition to being written in ink, the history of humanity was also destroyed by fire. It is common to characterize the evolution of contemporary science as a gradual ascent from superstition to reason, from ignorance to enlightenment. However, if you examine that voyage more closely, an oddity starts to show. Many types of old knowledge were rejected because they didn't align with the prevailing worldview of their era. Furthermore, whenever something is called heretical or superstitious, it usually has more to do with power than with reason. Had highly developed medical systems long before modern medicine emerged. These systems were frequently far more advanced than what is typically associated with their time. More than 2,000 years ago, brain surgery was described in Indian scriptures. Centuries before, the development of the microscope, the Chinese charted energy meridians. However, all of that was disregarded as modern rational science gained dominance. No quantitative data, no microscopes, no chemical formulas. Then superstition must be the cause. The similar phenomenon occurred in astronomy in antiquity. Astonishingly accurate calendars were created by the Babylonians, the Mer, and the Egyptians. Some of these calendars monitored astronomical occurrences, star cycles, and the axial tilt of the Earth with accuracy that wasn't verified until much later in contemporary times. They depended on centuries' worth of accumulated knowledge, observation, and intuition. But the entire corpus of old knowledge was dismissed as myth when Galileo and Copernicus ushered in the era of modern cosmology. How these civilizations did it right was never questioned. Their methods were not recognized. Therefore, they were simply disregarded. Next emerged the understanding of non-material energy. From bowfields to psychic occurrences to life force cannot be measured with the tools available today. Is not scientific if it cannot be validated in a laboratory. Once more, information was disregarded, not because it was incorrect, but rather because it didn't fit the mold. However, who makes the mold? Science hasn't developed in a vacuum for centuries. It has developed alongside and frequently under the influence of governments, corporations, academies, and the church, among other influential institutions. Exploration was promoted when science was used to support it. Science was shut down because it posed incorrect questions. Galileo was condemned for his assertion that the Earth circled around the sun, until modern inorganic chemistry demonstrated that alchemists could transform lead into gold. They were labeled insane. Those who asserted that energy healing was possible were written down as quacks. The irony, however, is this. Many concepts that were once labeled heresy are today referred to as cutting-edge science. The notion itself was never the issue. This is always Thaisu, who is in charge of determining which concepts are permitted to exist. Additionally, buried ancient knowledge is frequently replaced by more controllable knowledge, knowledge that avoids probing the depths of the human psyche, a knowledge that is more useful for production, conflict, and consumption than for connection, healing, and self-discovery. Therefore, it is not only a question of why ancient information was disregarded, it is the one who gains when humanity loses sight of its past. We typically envision monarchs, empires, armies, invasions, well-defined hierarchies, and nearly always men when we think of ancient civilizations, from pharaohs to popes, tsars, emperors, and other powerful leaders. Almost all of the titles are male, and they have been used throughout history. However, if we go far beyond the bounds of official history, we start to discover odd shards, tiny stone figurines, elaborate carvings, and symbols that recur frequently throughout the ancient globe. The mother goddess, from earth goddesses in Anatolia to the Venus of Willendorf in Europe, to the goddesses of the Mara and the stone idols of the Vindus Valley. These pictures all date from before written civilization existed, and they don't show women as weak or submissive. They stand for cosmic presence, fertility, power, and creation. Instead of dominance, it is the universe as perceived through the prism of life. It's likely that humanity originally lived under a different model, a matriarchal structure where power was centered around the mother and religion focused on connection, birth, and nutrition rather than conquest. Before society was founded on empires, hierarchies, and conflict. Furthermore, this concept is not nebulous or mythical. It is backed up by the research of hundreds of archaeologists, such as Maria Gimbutas, who detailed a time thousands of years ago when societies coexisted peacefully without the use of weapons or fortifications, and women were central to both culture and religion. The model abruptly vanished from the official historical record. The growth of patriarchal empires, never-ending battles, and male dynasties are the only topics covered in school textbooks. There are no chapters on harmonious societies governed by women or teachings on civilizations founded on harmony rather than dominance. Why? A change in global power might hold the key to the solution. A new social system, a patriarchal paradigm in which the strongest governed and men controlled religion, the military, and politics, was introduced by northern warrior nomadic tribes as they swept throughout various regions, and they had to destroy the old worldview in order to create a new one. They needed to transform goddesses into servants. Father Sky should be substituted for Mother Earth. Rewrite the stories. Of origin, humans were created from clay by an all-powerful male deity rather than by a goddess. Thus, the feminine half of human memory was tucked away, hidden under metaphors, symbols, or written off as folklore, and new myths, religions, and historical events emerged. However, the things that are silenced hardly ever go away. They are still there in our collective unconscious, as symbols on cave walls, and those remnants of an earlier feminine civilization are starting to reappear. As we start to consider the gender disparity in contemporary society, to complete the vision of mankind, not to supplant patriarchal history, a picture of birth as well as battle, of caring as well as off-rule, not just of power, but also of bonding. The mother used to be the center of the universe in this history. History is sometimes said to have been written by the winners. However, few pause long enough to fully understand the significance of that, because one side does not simply seize the land, the money, or the people when they win a conflict. They are entitled to share the narrative, and the truth no longer resembles that story most of the time. Look at the global map here. How many territories were formerly part of whole distinct cultures before they were subjugated, absorbed, and then silently wiped out of history? A large portion of Europe was originally inhabited by Celts. They left behind old triple spiral emblems, solar worship customs, and stone temples. However, they were labeled barbarians once the Roman Empire grew. Their culture was assimilated, their language was silenced, and their faith was banned. The Celts are but a side note to our study of Rome's splendor today. North American indigenous peoples, with hundreds of tribes, dialects, trading networks, and profound belief systems rooted in nature, millions of people have lived on that continent for thousands of years. Europeans did not refer to it as a civilization when they first arrived. They referred to it as a wilderness and transformed the process of traversing it into an exploration. The history of modern America does not start with someone who was already here. It starts with our arrival. Australia's Aboriginal people are the planet's oldest continuously existing culture. Having inhabited the continent for more than 60,000 years, however, upon their arrival, the British declared it to be tyrannous, a land that belonged to no one. Simply remove them from the communal memory. Treaties and recognition are not necessary. It's not just old history either. Entire cultures were destroyed in a matter of decades during the 20th century alone as a result of conflict, propaganda, and altered textbooks. Conquerors were portrayed to us as explorers. We dubbed this modernization of cultural annihilation. We buried the names of the losers and erected statues for the winners. The quiet in the history books, however, isn't the most tragic aspect. It occurs when a whole population starts to accept the skewed version, when they were taught at school that their forefathers were uncivilized, archaic, and backward, when their native tongue is forgotten, when they are proud to have resembled the ones who defeated them. History doesn't have to be burnt at that moment. It has already had an internal replacement, and the response is always the same when you question who gains. The winners are the ones who utilize memory itself as an instrument of control, rewrite history in their own language, and instill their ideals. However, recollection never really fades. It lurks in folk songs, traditions, and the unsaid sorrow of a generation that has no idea why they can no longer see their relatives' faces. Explorers like Christopher Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and Ferdinand Magellan are sometimes hailed in modern history as the world's first explorers. They are portrayed to us as trailblazers who uncovered uncharted continents and opened the way to globalization. But let's take some time to think. The Americas were first discovered by Columbus. What about the millions who already called that place home? Are they not considered? What about the Chinese, Arab, African, and even Northern European navigators and sailors? In this time frame, where are they? In actuality, a number of explorers arrived much before Columbus. They're just not brought up. And it's not because they weren't significant. They didn't fit the accepted narrative, which is why consider Zhang He, a Muslim admiral of the Ming dynasty in China. He commanded enormous fleets that traveled as far as East Africa across the Indian Ocean in the 15th century. The size of his ships was 3 times that of Columbus's. He carried scholars, merchandise, and even libraries on his thousands of nautical mile journeys. He wasn't here to win. He contributed expertise and diplomacy. However, all documentation of his travels was purposefully destroyed after the Ming court changed its political stance. One of the most significant periods in maritime history was removed from the official narrative, or the Arab navigators who anchored in East Africa and Southeast Asia centuries before European, and who had charted monsoon winds and stars. Flags were not planted by them. Some sources indicate missions crossing the Atlantic long before Columbus. However, they do not count or take into consideration the Mali Empire under Mansa Abu Bakr II, because they did not claim discovery of regions already inhabited. However, they are still not recognized. Perhaps the explanation is straightforward. They weren't Caucasian. The Norse Vikings also made it to Canada's Fundland. They set up camps and engaged in trade with the local populace. However, their account was classified as myth because it didn't fit the narrative of contemporary Western discovery. Historians didn't start to accept Viking colonies in North America until modern archaeology proved it. Columbus, however, continues to be at the heart of the story. It's not simply that we lose their names when we forget these explorers. We no longer see how they traveled the world. Gunpowder was not brought by most places that already had names, were not renamed. They did not use blood to etch their legacy on maps. However, people who came to connect rather than conquer are never referred to as heroes in a world where conquering defines history. Additionally, you are excluded from the textbook if you are not a conqueror. The question then becomes, are we now mature enough to reflect on those journeys through the eyes of people who traveled to learn, to give, to build bridges rather than burn them, rather than through the eyes of empire? Because perhaps just possibly they are the explorers that the modern world most needs. The topics of occupation, resource exploitation, and imposed regimes are frequently discussed while discussing colonialism. However, one element is perhaps more harmful than the others. Despite being rarely acknowledged, history is being rewritten. Western empires did not simply come to Africa, Asia, or Latin America for the sake of stealing gold, enslaving people, or promoting religion for hundreds of years. They arrived with a much riskier mission: to shed light on the history of the peoples they branded as barbarians. Indigenous histories were missed at first and then erased. Despite having highly developed drainage systems, urban planning, and mathematics from more than 4,000 years ago, the Indus Valley civilization in India was deemed primitive. They asserted that black Africans could not have constructed the Timbuktu Library, the stone cities of Zimbabwe, or the pyramids of Sudan. It must have been done for them by someone else. The wealthy Inca, Maya, and Aztec civilizations in Latin America were portrayed only in terms of bloodshed and sacrifice, omitting their remarkable accomplishments in construction, medicine, and astronomy. Colonial textbooks were purposefully incorrect, not just incorrect, not due to a lack of proof, but rather to a more profound fear. Colonized peoples might cease bending their heads if they recalled their former selves. As a result, Indian students were taught more about British kings than their own for more than a century. African youngsters were told that Columbus had found places that had been inhabited for thousands of years by their ancestors. Native American children were told that their ancestors were primitive and wild, sent to boarding schools, and prohibited from using their native tongues. Many archaeological findings were changed or suppressed, merely because they did not fit Thrustern-centered chronology, to avoid acknowledging that Africans previously created one of the greatest civilizations in human history. European researchers in the 19th and 20th centuries referred to the ancient Egyptians as white. Official archives did not include maps from ancient China or the Arab world. Native American languages were deemed aesthetic and not deserving of being preserved. What was the outcome, then? The true history of their forefathers was unknown to billions of people as they grew up. Worse, they were trained to feel guilty about it, because you don't need chains if you want to rule someone for generations. All you have to do is make them think their forefathers never accomplished anything noteworthy, thought all advancements were external, and they need to be appreciative, rather than inquisitive. However, the truth is not permanently hidden. More people are relearning their ancestral languages, looking at ancient maps, and listening to band albums these days, and they are learning that their past was never less than present. It was merely recounted in the conqueror's voice. Think again if you believe that the individuals who influenced history are usually those who are mentioned in textbooks. As we have seen, history is not a record of neutrality. It's a battleground of memory where names are either kept or removed, depending on whether they support the narrative of the powerful rather than their inherent value. Numerous people have influenced entire civilizations over thousands of years. However, educational curricula never mention them by name. There are no monuments erected in their honor. No national holiday honors them. Deliberately, they vanished. Consider science. Are you familiar with Hypatia, Alexandria's most accomplished female mathematician, astronomer, and philosopher? She commanded the city's most prestigious school of thought, taught in public, wrote books on mathematics, physics, and astronomy, and lived in the 4th century. However, she was labeled a witch because she was a woman and not a Christian. Her books were destroyed, and she was mercilessly killed in the streets by a zealous mob. She is mentioned in passing as a tragic case today. Or think of Ibn al-Haytham, the Arab scholar who established the scientific method in the 10th century. Centuries before Europe's scientific revolution, he investigated light, perception, and optics. However, his name is hardly referenced in the majority of contemporary physics courses. He didn't fit. Similar to this, Wan Zhenyi, a Chinese woman astronomer from the 18th century who created theories ahead of their time, published mathematical textbooks, and hand-built models of solar eclipses, is excluded from conventional history because she didn't conform to the norms of her feudal society. There were reformers in politics, people who attempted to build more equitable societies and dared to confront injustice were either ridiculed, banished, or completely erased because they didn't align with the goals of empires. It's possible that many of the well-known inventions we identify with well-known people didn't originate with them. Black inventors who were enslaved, Arab artisans who constructed architectural marvels, and women who developed life-saving medications were all present. However, more respectable names were given credit for their inventions. History abruptly altered the owners of legacies as well as territory. Therefore, the question is not how many outstanding individuals we have overlooked. Why it was necessary to forget them is the true question. Perhaps because they questioned the status quo. Perhaps because they made it harder for empires to defend their supremacy by drawing a distinction between savage and civilized. Perhaps because they were indigenous women, people of color, or foreigners. However, we lose more than just a few stories when those names are removed. We become incapable of imagining Gnotheritry, a society free from monopolies in science, when gender and skin color are not used to determine IQ. Where is it possible to trust the truth without a license? Ever consider the possibility that we are living in the wrong century? What if the whole historical chronology we were taught was not only imperfect, but essentially false? This isn't some crazy plot. The exact chronology of human civilization has been questioned by an increasing number of independent scholars, alternative archaeologists, and unorthodox historians for more than a century. The existence of ancient cultures is not denied by them. They wonder how long they've been around and in what sequence. The phantom time concept, put forth by German historian Herbert Illig in the 1990s, is among the most contentious hypotheses. Nearly 300 years of European history, from 614 to 911 AD, might never have occurred, Illig said. Powerful individuals, most notably Emperor Otto III and Pope Sylvester II, fabricated these centuries. The entire human timeline may have been pushed forward by almost 3 centuries as a result of the incorrect dating of hundreds of royal dynasties. It may sound crazy, but Illig and other researchers provide disturbing hints. Numerous important events that occurred between 614 and 911 AD lack conclusive archaeological evidence. The so-called Dark Ages art and architecture exhibit little to no development, as though time had stopped. Numerous changes. 2 ancient date systems left perplexing holes and inconsistencies that remain unsolved. Some argue that they might be thousands of years older than previously thought by citing ancient megalithic structures, such as the Egyptian pyramids. At least 11,000 years ago, a huge, highly developed temple complex was built. That was before writing, before agriculture, and before civilization as we know it today. Archaeologists have been forced to reconsider the entire story of human social evolution as a result of its existence. Perhaps many ancient civilizations once flourished and were forgotten if Göbekli Tepe was real and constructed by a highly developed, organized culture. Why, therefore, would our timings be so inaccurate? Was there insufficient proof or a technical glitch? Was it deliberate or even more unsettling? Because when authority tries to manipulate memory, it rewrites time as well as the narrative. You also have influence over the order of accomplishments when you have control over the timeline. What came before and what came later is up to you. You present historical events in a way that exalts some while erasing others. In this way, individuals who arrived later are referred to as advanced, while those who arrived earlier are referred to as primitive. The distinction between the savage and the civilized is then cemented in stone. What if it's truly 1725 instead of 2025? Buddy, what if human civilization started 30,000 years ago instead of 6,000 years ago, as textbooks claim? Would you dare to inquire about our understanding of ourselves as well as of history? The secrets of history were hidden for ages by well-worn justifications, such as insufficient proof, misplaced manuscripts, unintelligible scripts, and impossibility of verification. All of it, however, is changing more quickly than anyone anticipated. What was once thought to be lost forever is now unexpectedly within reach because of artificial intelligence and digitization technologies. Just hours of data processing, from burnt books and broken stones to long-dead languages, will replace centuries of laborious inquiry. And as a result, old truths were revealed in addition to fresh information. Consider 2023, the ancient scrolls of Herculaneum, a city buried beside Pompeii by a volcanic eruption, were decoded by researchers using artificial intelligence. The carbonized scrolls were thought to be unreadable for centuries, but with the help of deep learning algorithms, the words started to appear, letter by letter and line by line, exposing lost philosophical writings and concepts that had never been mentioned in popular history. Similar to this, artificial intelligence is currently using satellite imagery and old maps to find architectural patterns hidden beneath the Sahara Desert, the Amazon jungle, or the Mediterranean seafloor. These buildings may be from long-forgotten civilizations, but they are not mentioned in any history books. Bigger problems are being raised by AI's comparison of old texts from many civilizations, which has shown startling parallels that scholarly circles had missed. Was there ever a world knowledge system, a common network of knowledge that predated the internet, sea travel, and even maps? In some innovative projects, artificial intelligence is being trained on millions of historical and archaeological records to forecast missing patterns, such as the chance that unidentified civilizations have existed or the potential sites of unknown cities. However, this is arguably AI's most potent feature. It is not biased by history. It has no allegiance to any nation, religion, or ideology. It merely tracks the data and reveals what we have overlooked or willfully disregarded. Many see this as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to re-examine history free from the constraints of curriculum, dogma, and empire. Others, however, are uncomfortable because will some authorities intervene to censor the data, limit the algorithms, or control the results if AI starts to expose too much? Any instrument that alters history is, after all, a danger to the power that uses it. Thank you for joining Secret Historian on this extraordinary journey into the warnings left behind by those who vanished. If you believe the past still holds wisdom, if you know deep down that history was never a sleep only waiting, subscribe now to Secret Historian.